Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar. I'm the Deputy Director of the LSE South Asia Center, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you this afternoon to yet another event, a weekly event. The event this afternoon is titled Women and the Future of Work in South Asia. And my name is Nilanjan Sarkar. I'm the Deputy Director of the LSE. And that's my iPad going off. We are looking forward very much to hearing from our panel of speakers and experts. But before that, could I extend a very warm welcome to our audience who've joined us from across the world, across time zones. And thank you also for your interest in not only in signing up, but sending us emails and inquiring about the event. We have no doubt that you'll find it very, very interesting. As you will notice, this event is actually happening via Zoom, but is being live streamed on YouTube. The chat function on the YouTube page has been enabled. So please do ask questions. Please feel free to ask questions. You are welcome to pose questions to individual speakers. You're also welcome to pose a question to the entire panel. If you're going to ask a question to an individual speaker, then please do mention the speaker's name so we can ask the question accordingly. If you would like to tweet, then please tag it at SAsiaLSC. If you would like to tag individual speakers, then you will notice that on the YouTube page in the details, the Twitter handles of the speakers have been mentioned. So please do so. If this event had been held on site at LSE, then members of the audience at LSE public events have the right to ask questions without revealing their identity. Now, in keeping with the spirit of that, when we ask questions, we will not be mentioning your name, even though we know that you will be, your names will be visible on YouTube to others, but at least we will stay close to the spirit of it. We have had a prior discussion about the order in which the speakers will speak. So without further ado, it is now my very pleasant task to introduce the speakers. Once I have done the introductions, I will hand over to Alnoor, who will speak briefly about the event this afternoon, and then the experts will make their initial remarks. I will come back later on to pose questions from the audience. Alnoor Bhimani is director of the LSE South Asia Center, is professor in management accounting at LSE, and is the author, most recently, of Accounting Disrupted: How Digitalization is Changing Finance. It was published in 2021, earlier this year. Rubana is chairperson and managing director of the Mohammadi group, which is in Bangladesh, though today she is speaking to us from Calcutta in India. Prithwiraj Choudhury is Lumry Family Associate Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School and is especially interested in the future of work. I do want to say a special thanks to Prithwiraj because he was the expert with the shortest amount of notice that we gave for him to join this panel. So we're very grateful to you for your time this afternoon. Uzma Quresh is Senior Social Development Specialist in Gender at the World Bank in Pakistan and is based in Islamabad. Alnoor, I'm going to hand over to you now, and please carry on with the discussion.
Thanks very much, Nilanjan. Great pleasure to be with you all. We have some, really very interesting guests. I've been looking at the work that they've been doing, and it speaks to the issues that we want to discuss today directly. If we look at these types of issues, it relates really, of course, to South Asia, but women in South Asia and the impact of emerging technologies on their lives, on the work that they do, on the work that they're not going to be able to do. If we think about women in Asia generally, then we find that there are massive structural disadvantages that they face, really from childhood to education to work, if they can get work or if they're allowed to work, to retirement. So the sorts of things that we want to explore really relate to how will emerging technologies change all that. If we look at the literature and we listen to certain commentators on the power of technology to change lives, then the story that is presented is actually very optimistic. It's very rosy indeed. Essentially, technology offers a whole array of opportunities, of possibilities for growth, and so on. But the truth is that it also represents a huge number of risks. If we think of women in South Asia, very often education is the key to enablement, to empowerment, to liberation, in a sense. But it's the sorts of areas that we want to be looking at in education that seems to power women in the West, which women in South Asia may not have access to. For instance, the ability of a woman in South Asia to engage in STEM subjects. Are there barriers to entry there? What are the solutions? This is the sorts of things that we want to be exploring. In a sense, technology allows work to come to people. But if people cannot use those technologies, then that becomes a real problem. So we want to explore the extent to which women who can access the technology can actually use it, and whether indeed they can access that technology. There are approximately 3 billion internet users globally, and the question that we might ask is, are women in South Asia part of that 3 billion? Are they excluded? Are they too late in joining that force? So these are the sorts of issues that we want to explore today. I'd like to kick off with Rubana. We've had a brief introduction there, but I think that she's commented quite widely on workers out on the street during the time of COVID for a variety of reasons, of course. And I'm particularly interested in women out on the street because they don't have work. You had said, Rubana, at one stage that people on the street is a chaos we cannot afford. And I'd like to ask you whether you think digitization and emerging technologies are actually going to increase that level of chaos.
Thanks. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Just to answer your question on my comments during when COVID hit us first, I'm sure you've read that we literally received almost $3 billion worth of cancellation, which came down to 1.8 later on. And then, of course, the payment contract terms were all changed. So we received payments almost after a year, and sometimes we had serious cancellations. So it was a tough time for us. And at one point, everybody had literally said that we may have 500,000 workers out of job. And then, luckily, because they all returned to work and business started coming in, we in total had only 44,000 job losses. So that kind of minimized and everything went on. But, you know, life just does not go on as usual for the workers, because there's something that we should have realized before we even started this business, which of course was a learning curve. We should have had an unemployment scheme, which we didn't. I mean, we do contribute 0.3% to the Workers' Welfare Fund, which goes directly to the government, and from there, the disbursements are made. But even then, considering that Bangladesh basically pays $423 million worth of salary every month, it becomes a huge issue for us to have that kind of reserve. That only brings us back to the point that we talk about ethical practices and sustainable sourcing, sustainable supply chain, but we never think about the disconnect between those who are sourcing from us and the price that we are being paid. So therefore, when there's a disconnect between sourcing and sustainability, it becomes difficult for us to actually promise sustainable livelihoods. And also, if there is going to be a change with these workers facing the new fourth industrial revolution, no, because they are not going to be overnight coders. They are not educated up to that extent. Therefore, you know, I think when we talk about reskilling the workers, we have to be very, very careful, and we have to think about what is the other option that Bangladesh has. Bangladesh is heavily dependent on ready-made garment sector. Therefore, we haven't really substantially diversified. So we need to find out what we are going to diversify into next before we decide the fate of our workers. As is, you know, we have many jacquard machines now in the sweater factories. Therefore, workers have been replaced and they've taken job in other factories and doing other things. But when it happens in a grander scale, which we think it will happen, we are currently around 8% automated. By 2025, we should be a little, probably close to 20%. So that's when the challenge begins. We are always hopeful about workers not getting replaced and displaced. But, reality of the whole thing is, where is the system? Are we working towards it? Is there a cohesive plan which we have in place? I don't see any till date. I mean, there are, of course, positive moves being made, but reskilling is still just kind of baaton ki baat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's really quite useful to get as a perspective. If we look at the extent to which we find, robots and automation taking place in factory environments, and certainly garment and textile industries, does the utilization of machines not imply that organizations can simply insource back what they need to be making? Countries will basically make what they need to make since they're using machines. And doesn't that place the Bangladesh sort of workers at extreme risk? Because there is a potential that actually the work is going to dry out in one country and simply be undertaken somewhere else where it's needed by machines. So isn't that a real concern for you?
It is, because lots of onshoring has begun. People are, even in America, they're kind of dreaming that they'll be making the basic T-shirts there. And you will notice that with COVID, our consumer habits have changed. We want to buy less, we want to buy online, we want everything sort of, tailor-made. Therefore, Bangladesh is really not geared up for 200 pieces production. We do, even in my own factory, I do 50,000 pieces of shirts every day. So, to have that kind of scale and not being able to actually qualify to be a custom-made, perfect fit for an online business, it's difficult. We have B2B platforms, but we don't have B2C. So that is where the other nations are going to go forward. So for us, what is going to be the model? And when we talk about sustainable, there's so much dichotomy and hypocrisy in the whole system. We talk about sustainability, but we don't take into consideration that fast fashion is actually not sustainable. Yet we have pressures from the buyers saying that, hey, you have to supply within 4 weeks or 2 weeks or 3 weeks if it's local fabric. So there are many buyers who actually want 100% organic, but the mode of shipment is air. So how do you justify such I'm not hypocrisies, I'm probably being too harsh, but there are, again, serious and critical disconnects between what is being projected and what is being practiced. So we all have to also realize that, when we talk about a workforce of 4 million workers, we have to be more mindful. And we have to also showcase our workers and tell our stories properly, because it is a human world. And it's, my tagline always has been, go human, go green. So if that be the case, if you really want to go human and go green, then you will think twice about replacing these workers without having an alternative and feasible platform. So Bangladesh can easily diversify into light engineering. Perhaps that's the sector. So, literacy is key, and reskilling. And there's nothing else that we can do, actually.
Okay, thanks very much. You've made that very, very, very clear indeed. And I think this might be seen as a solution, or at least something to be addressed across countries in South Asia. So that situation doesn't seem to, in fact, be unique. I wanted to turn to you, Uzma. You've written a really huge amount, and you've talked about issues of gender inequality and the need for gender balance, and linking that to economic growth. I think your sense is that in relation to Pakistan, for instance, we might have approximately 25% of the workforce who are women. Most of them, it turns out, are in agriculture. And your sense is that that should really increase to about 45% ideally in the next sort of 7, 8, 9 years, perhaps earlier than that. But I wanted to ask you, with the onset of more usage of digital technologies, is that a likely target that we're going to be able to achieve, do you think? Now, I can't hear you, Uzma, but I'm not sure whether the rest of the audience can.
Uzma, I think it might be better if you use your iPad.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. I hope you can hear me now. Thank you for inviting me, Alnoor. I think in Pakistan's case, when you talk about, increasing women's labor force participation to 45%, that will not happen in another 10 years or even in 20 years, because the countries that have done, other countries, we have seen examples of, exponentially increasing the female labor force participation, but that took time. And in Pakistan's case, there are so many barriers, as you know, in terms of accessing economic opportunities. So this 45% target is not feasible, not practical, even in the next 10 years. I'll briefly discuss the determinants of female labor force participation in Pakistan, because our trajectory is very different from Bangladesh. We are very similar probably to India and also to Afghanistan, unfortunately, before invasion. So, if you look at Pakistan's labor market, we have seen an increase in the share of women in paid employment from 11% in 1993 to 20.3%. So yes, female labor participation is increasing, but the growth is very slow. And about this increase in female labor force participation, Alnoor, like you mentioned, a large share of these, new women held jobs, they were in unpaid occupations, like, on household farms or on agricultural farms. So this definitely contrasts the job creation that was there. A large share of, the jobs that were held by men, they were in industry and services sectors. So as more women, they enter the labor force, the average quality of women-held jobs, that didn't improve at the same rate, of course, as it did for men. So simply making, the increase in female labor force participation our target or the yardstick for positive development, this is not going to serve the purpose. Share of women with above secondary education has also increased in Pakistan, but higher levels of education increase, generally women's overall probability getting a paid job. But in case of Pakistan, secondary education or above, it actually fell by 5% between 1993 and 2018. And also at the same time, educated men, of course, they didn't experience any such decline. So this implies that the course on labor force participation, this is definitely being offset by a rising share of the more educated women who are probably not willing or they're unable to join the workforce. And if you look at our urban areas, this actually presents a slightly different issue. Post-secondary education, in case of urban areas, stronger on women's labor force participation compared to rural women. But if you look at all educated labor force compared to urban women. So in World Bank's recent survey, we did it in 2019 in urban Peshawar, it also indicated that highly educated women, they accounted for overall 1/10 of women in working age of Peshawar, but 1/4 of employed women. So other than education, you already mentioned, the key constraints to female labor force participation. They plague women's opportunities in Pakistan very, very, deeply, access to childcare facilities, women's overwhelming representation in household responsibilities, safety and security concerns. They are so great in public spaces, on public transport, at workplaces. Several studies, they indicate that if women don't feel safe in their neighborhoods, they are not going to, they are less likely to apply for paid employment opportunities outside their homes. And women are also overwhelmingly represented in Pakistan's case, also in India. In fact, it's a South Asian phenomena in the informal, workforce, particularly home-based work. So 70.7% of our women in the workforce, they are in the informal sector. And Pakistan's low female labor force participation and then high number of women in the informal economy, they also highlight the disparity in economic opportunity that's there and unfavorable conditions that women experience. So informal home-based workers, we all know they have remained a largely invisible workforce, not just in Pakistan, in South Asia, in terms of their identification and their contribution to economy. So, but despite these challenges, the share of home-based workers, it's growing. And more in women's case, it has not grown in men's case. And COVID-19, like you also mentioned, it has exacerbated these, deep-rooted gender inequality in the labor market. So with economic uncertainty, informal jobs, which account for most of women's employment, they have been the first to go in case of pandemic. And informal economy workers, they also were struggling to any social protection benefits. And COVID-19, it also hit women businesses in Pakistan more disproportionate. Micro enterprises, they were 8% more likely to experience total loss of revenue compared to male businesses that were technology and digital, inclusion. Of course, in Pakistan also, we have to factor in the use of technology. But Pakistan is also, as I'm sure you all know, it's experiencing a digital transformation with rapidly connections. And in fact, the number of internet connections, subscriptions, including mobile subscriptions, they increased from 6 to 80 million between 2014 and 2019. But like you also pointed out, gender digital divide in Pakistan is also huge. For example, I can give you example of Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa provinces. Only 6 and 5%, women in rural areas, they said in PSLM, Pakistan Social Living and Measurement survey, they said that they used internet at some point in the last 3 and 12 months. And if you compare it with men, in Punjab's case, it was 23% men in rural areas. So yeah, overall percentage is low, but women's percentage is very, very low. And in Pakistan, overall, it's only 12% women who use internet compared to 21% men. Pakistan also has the largest gender gap in mobile ownership. Due to regressive social norms, and it's young women and girls, many a times they are not even allowed to use mobile phones, and its presence may lead to gender-based violence. Also, there have been several incidences where women, young girls, they have been killed because they had phones. For their economic and educational prospects, women can, of course, theoretically benefit, from equal access to technology. And for women home-based businesses and informal workers also, like I talked about, their access to internet can transform their lives. It can provide them opportunities for expansion and growth of their businesses. It can connect them to markets. It can facilitate access to investment and finance, but this will, that informal workers, they are equipped with digital literacy, so they can leverage technology to support their work. Pakistan, there is also a huge issue of untapped resources. For example, women doctors, they are highly educated women, but they don't engage in paid work after marriage. So there are some very good encouraging examples. I'm sure you know, there are online platforms in Pakistan that have enabled some of these women doctors to provide medical advice to patients, while working from home. So, and Pakistan's overall digital adoption rate is low. And skill programs, they will also need to be adapted to utilize opportunities in the gig economy. And if you look at overall global studies, they do talk about, the gig economy, the benefits of it, but they also say that it only caters to a specific group of workers and it leaves large sections of the workforce without any opportunities. And like I talked about these, women engaged in telemedicine. So for some women, the fast growing digital economy, it does provide new opportunities to participate in the labor market. But technology-based platforms, they generally tend to favor urban English-speaking people. And women, they usually engage in lower value activities. So other studies also in Kenya, South Africa, they also revealed that, if we need, gig economy to work to provide these movements. Our own analysis, World Bank's own analysis also indicated that, 3G network, that's very low. Its coverage is very low in Pakistan, and poor network quality. These are some key barriers to digital inclusion, especially in rural areas. And a very recent research, it also shows that a lot of home-based work, they actually remain underexploited because of inadequate IT skills in the overall population. So there are several companies that are open to this option of women working from home. In fact, all their workforce to work from home, but the opportunities, they are underutilized. But at the same time, also, like Alnoor, you also talked about, the challenges and the threat of violence that women experience. So if we are talking about, technology, we also have to simultaneously invest in services that provide counseling and legal support to address sexual harassment and bullying against women and children that they experience online. According to a national helpline in Pakistan, there was a 145% increase in gender-based violence complaints that they received in the initial months of COVID lockdown. So this definitely requires, organizing rigorous awareness-raising interventions by the government, by development partners to highlight this issue and work towards its prevention by tackling these harmful social norms that are perpetuating gender-based violence against women. And if we also want to see more women taking advantage of technology and joining the digital revolution that we are talking about to achieve economic empowerment, this will not happen just by simply focusing on, let's say, digital and financial literacy for women. We'll have to, acknowledge and address those persistent key gaps that exist in various spheres and that obstruct women's economic inclusion in the first place. So
thanks very much. I have a very, very comprehensive overview of the situation and the impact of technologies on women in Pakistan. And it does look like urbanized environments have very different experiences from the more rural ones, which in itself is really quite interesting, because I think there are other countries where inclusion comes out of technology enabling rural areas to be reached. Perhaps less so in the case of Pakistan. I looked recently at studies in Pakistan, and one of these studies showed that as the cost of technology decreases, the harassment on women by partners increases, simply because they become sort of more connected, more wired, and there's a fear essentially of being unable to control. But aside from that, another study I think that I looked at showed that about 70% of women who are not at work said that they were not at work because they weren't allowed to be at work. So it does seem to me that one could talk about the impact of education as an enabling force, but it also seems to me that it's the impact on education or of education on males that might actually begin to change attitudes. So it's not just financial literacy, it's actually understanding the broader context in which women can contribute to the workforce. So I think those areas are really quite fascinating, and Pakistan represents a really quite interesting case in point. But I wanted to then switch to potentially a more positive view from Prithwiraj, because everything that I read that you write about the emergence of technology seems to offer a much more optimistic picture of things. Much of your research is based on Western organizations. One of the things that you said, and I'll just read it out because it comes out of your study, that work from anywhere affects communication, including brainstorming, problem solving, knowledge sharing, socialization, camaraderie, mentoring, performance evaluation, compensation, data security, and regulation. So pretty much everything that we tend to think as being associated with technologies changing the environments of work. But I wanted to ask you whether some of those things relate in very different ways. They play out very differently in South Asian countries. Would you agree with that, or do you think it's pretty generic as a picture?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my research, Alnoor. So maybe I should just first quickly summarize what my research is about. And part of my research is actually with South Asian companies such as TCS, which is a technology giant headquartered in India, and also BRAC, which is a very, very large organization in Bangladesh. So what I've been studying for many years now, much before the pandemic, is this form of remote work that I call work from anywhere. And the key sort of conceptual distinction about work from anywhere compared to the regular work from home is that in work from anywhere, the worker now gets to choose which town, city, village, or state she wants to live in. And then she could be working from home, she could be working from a co-working space, but most importantly, she decides whether to live in Calcutta or Khulna or a smaller village in Kerala, whatever she wants to, wherever she wants to live. And so the sort of argument I've made through my research is that beyond other benefits, there are many benefits to workers and to companies from embracing work from anywhere. But one of the key benefits, or two of the most important benefits that's relevant for today's discussion, are the following. First, work from anywhere lets organizations hire from anywhere. So if you are a small Silicon Valley startup and you are now competing against Google and Facebook to hire programmers in the Bay Area, which is really tough, you can open your hiring geography and now hire from programmers from Kenya or Bangladesh. And actually, when I looked recently at data from Stack Overflow, which is a community of programmers, I was pleasantly surprised to see a large concentration of programmers in Bangladesh. And potentially, this is untapped human capital for tech companies around the world. The second big benefit of work from anywhere, so hire from anywhere is one of the benefits I'm really excited about. The second benefit is it awards more equality to the workforce in the following way. There's at least 3 decades of research which has shown that women have foregone career opportunities because of geography. So you're working in Dhaka or Islamabad, and now there's a new promotion or a new opportunity in Peshawar or Chattogram, and you cannot move because your spouse doesn't want to move, or your children are in high school and they don't want to move. And so research has shown that women tend to forego of such opportunities because of geography. But if the organization lets you work from anywhere, like Uzma was saying about the telemedicine experts, you don't have to move anywhere. And that potentially solves not only the problem of receiving new opportunities, but also unsafe travel. Now you don't have to travel to regions where you don't feel personally secure. And so it creates a much more equal workforce from the point of gender. So let me now share some specific research insights and would love to get your thoughts beyond that. So when I looked at work from anywhere, from the lens of BRAC, which is, as I guess all of us know, a very large organization in Bangladesh. And we were able to conduct an experiment last summer where we were randomly assigning which human resource employees, HR workers in BRAC could go to the office in the month of July and the month of August. So it was a randomized control trial where we randomly determined which workers were able to work from home versus work from office. And the main headline finding is that the workers who were able to spend an intermediate amount of time in the office, not too less, not a lot, intermediate, they were the most productive. And turns out the effect is much stronger for women, and especially women who are non-managers. And then when we interviewed these women and we conducted surveys, because our randomized control trial is determining causal treatment effects, but to understand why we're getting the effect, we conducted a survey for all the employees in the experiment. The women reported more satisfaction with remote work when they had intermediate levels of remote work. And they also reported more satisfaction with work-life balance. And they had countless anecdotes of how at least getting some intermediate flexibility about where to work was helpful for them to manage commute, to manage children, to manage household chores. Many of them had to cook 2 meals in the morning before taking off for the office, and being able to spend 2 or 3 days a week at home, they were able to plan those chores much better. And then many of them were now starting to take bigger responsibilities, managing field offices without even leaving Dhaka. So I'm very hopeful for how work from anywhere and remote work more broadly can create equality. The TCS example is also very interesting. So TCS is a company with 500,000 employees worldwide. Several 100,000 of them are in India. And they have adopted a model which they call 25% remote, which means each worker gets to go to the office only 25% of her time. And the worker doesn't decide that time. The TCS doesn't decide that frequency. The team decides. So some teams are deciding to become a day a week in the office teams. Some teams are deciding to be a week a month in the office teams. And some teams are saying, we will congregate in the office for 2 or 3 weeks in April, and then come back in July for 2 weeks, and then come back in October for 2 weeks. And I think when I interviewed, and I've studied this quite extensively now, women were really excited because in many cases, they were having problems finding housing in large cities, and now they could live in their parental home and travel to that city and share an Airbnb for the period of time they had to be in that large city. And they were also able to help their families while being back home. So I think in summary, remote work and work from anywhere can be a really, really positive tool for productivity in general, but specifically to enable the participation of women in the workforce and productivity of women. So those are my overall thoughts, Alnoor, and would love to take any questions, if any.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's very interesting, and the outcome of that research, I think is, it reveals things that we didn't know, and that really is fascinating. The whole idea of working from home or working from anywhere implies a whole array of things that might impact the lives of women specifically, and as you say, in very positive ways. I wonder though if I can ask you whether your data relates to very specific types of jobs, very specific types of industries, and of the type that don't actually encompass the greater majority of women in in nations within South Asia. I mean, certainly if I look at the case of Pakistan, we're looking at about 70 to 80% of women being in the agricultural economy. Perhaps many are in the care type, environments, mostly unpaid. Very few, I would imagine, would be able to access the sorts of jobs that you paint a fairly positive picture about in relation to the impact of technology. So and this idea of the 25-25 model, I think is pretty outstanding. But TCS is not the ordinary sort of employer for the majority of women in South Asia, I would imagine.
So yeah, I completely agree with the spirit of your comment. But here's one thought I'll add to the discussion. So while work from anywhere is probably, and for sure, certainly it's more amenable to the knowledge worker tasks that you describe, work from anywhere actually has a really interesting potential effect on the geographic distribution of talent. So if indeed work from anywhere leads to talent being more uniformly distributed across the countries in South Asia, and that's really, I think, good news for the large over-congested cities like Dhaka and Bangalore and Bangladesh, Islamabad. And if talent moves to these smaller towns, the prediction is, then what's going to happen is there'll be a greater demand for all kinds of services in smaller towns, childcare services, healthcare services. And the potential is there's a spillover effect, which might create employment opportunities down the line in all kinds of jobs in smaller towns, which might be fulfilled by local talent, including local women. So instead of the woman now having to migrate from her smaller town in Bangladesh or India or Pakistan, she might be able to work as a nurse because there's more demand for nursing services all over the country. So that is one spillover effect that I'm optimistic about, which might help all kinds of jobs.
Okay, thanks very much. I think you're probably right. There are spillover effects. So even though the focus of technology might be on one type of jobs, which you might refer to as knowledge workers, maybe the spillover can be non-technological, but it's still a positive spillover, which I think would be very interesting to study if we could access the data. I wanted to turn to Rubana, but I don't know whether we still have Rubana on. Oh, fantastic. Okay, there you are. Good to see you again. Now, your educational background is pretty fascinating. You started, I suppose, the entry into business about 25 years ago, and I'll ask you about that stuff in a moment. But what I did want to ask you is that you also, of course, are a poet, aside from all the other things that you do. And I want to ask you the extent to which you see your poetry as emancipatory for women, and what the impact might be for them if they read that poetry, or if others indeed do, what the impact might be on their working lives.
My poems are dark. So my poems are dark, and I write poetry only when I actually hurt and ache. So it's difficult. That's because my personal life, I've had massive tragedies hitting me. So that's kind of shaped my route. But poetry, I think there are different compartments that we have in our lives and within our heads. So we play different roles. I, for one, play it with absolute ease, because otherwise I wouldn't have survived. If I didn't have poetry, if I didn't have music, I wouldn't have as much empathy I have today for the people who work with me. So I think being a woman helps. I think we are better employers, and you have to forgive me for being so blunt, but we are better employers, we are better colleagues as women. Because we have more empathy, I think we run our businesses with a lot of compassion. So that's a claim that we have. And what I do is, though, I often speak to a lot of young women, young professionals who start their career, because I believe that the current generation needs mentors. And we must have a buddy system, and it has to be a case for hashtag she for she and not he for she, because that's more important for us. So we need to stand by that young generation, irrespective of their economic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, but we need to be there because we need to share, I wouldn't say wisdom necessarily, but just our experiences, because there's just so much to learn. We've struggled and, we have risen from the ashes like a phoenix. So it's important for us to also share our experiences with others. So whether it's poetry, whether it's work practice, whether it's just a habit, or whether it's just a friendly chat, any expression which may lead to empowerment is critical. And we must have absolutely free discussions. The discourses must be absolutely marked with honesty. So it's good to vent to another woman as well. So I encourage that, and I hope and I believe that I convey the message of courage to most women. I would like to.
Well, that's very, very good to hear. I think most authors would suggest things that are very similar. It just adds to your ability maybe to empathize with other people. And I think you've said several times that, a woman perhaps makes a better manager because of her ability to empathize with workers. If I can dig a little bit further into that, how do you think that might then be altered in a more digital economy? The ability, as you say, of women to empathize, perhaps better manage the workforce, better connect with that workforce, have more interaction that is conducive to understanding, some of the broader issues. How is that going to be impacted, do you think, by technology?
I mean, technology is all over Bangladesh now. We are very digitalized, and we are going forward as well. Our Honorable Prime Minister and her son, the advisor for ICT Ministry, is completely all about digital economy. So that's happening. What's interesting is we have more or less tried digitizing wages. So now we're having an it's a digital platform which is interoperable and which is vendor neutral. So that is coming into play now. So the central bank is adopting it. So anyone with a smartphone or a phone even can become a subscriber there. So digital economies, our Honorable Prime Minister gave us stimulus packages, but there was a strong requirement of all the wages being paid directly to them. So it couldn't come into our account. The wages were directly disbursed. So of course, there's a lot of blessing in digital economy. It's just that it's a question of empowerment. Can we bring our workers? For me, it's my 4 million workers that I think of all the time, because 70% of the 4 million are women. And with such a huge percentage, if we cannot really see what lies ahead, then it's a shame for us. So what we have done is we've kind of tried piloting. We've tried sending our workers to universities. So there's an Asian university for women in Chittagong, Chattogram now. It's an international university, and they take in garment workers. So they have 2 years access course. That's the time they kind of familiarize themselves with what's happening around them, and then they go for another 4 years. And trust me, the first batch graduated last December. They speak brilliant English. They are good, they are smart, and there's a lot of pride. I sense a lot of pride in them because they've weathered serious storms, and they are now there with children who are from much more affluent backgrounds. So that kind of parity, that kind of inclusiveness is what we dream of. So if we can bring our workers to that level, nothing like it.
Okay, all right, that's very good. I think that's a nice ambition to have. It's a nice target to certainly aim for. I'm going to turn back to Prithwiraj, but I will come back to you, Uzma. It's just that Prithwiraj may have to leave slightly earlier, so I wanted to get in his comments before he leaves. Now, in your research, one of the points that you make is that working from anywhere organizations, and I'm just quoting, you say have the potential to reverse the brain drain that often plagues emerging markets, small towns, and rural locations. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. And it is indeed one of the most exciting potentials from the work from anywhere phenomena that I'm sort of like very excited about. So once again, in work from anywhere, the worker gets to decide where to live, and she does not have to now live in the location where the company used to have an office or still has an office. And so what this means is, in many cases, workers don't have to deal with immigration issues. So the brain drain that South Asia has seen over decades, where workers have left for the United States and Western Europe, part of that now could be reversed if the companies in the West allow workers to live in their locations and work for the company. And also, beyond the international migration that can be avoided, there's also this potential for workers to not migrate to large urban clusters within our countries. So instead of everyone flocking to Dhaka or Calcutta or Noida or Islamabad or Bangalore, now workers can live in second, third, fourth tier towns because the cost of living is much cheaper. And many of the workers who have moved to the Bangalores of the world can return to their hometowns to be close to family and have a lower cost of living. So I feel the potential of reversing the brain drain is a real opportunity to set the stage again for labor to be more uniformly distributed. And one example I'll quickly mention from my research is with this small Midwestern city in America called Tulsa. So Tulsa is a city of just shy of 1 million people in the state of Oklahoma. And I've been studying them for 3.5 years now, before the pandemic. They have created an incentive for workers, remote workers, to move to Tulsa. So if you are a remote worker and you can work from Tulsa, excuse me, they pay you $10,000 to relocate. And they've been able to attract more than 1,300 families so far. And these families are moving from LA, from Boston, from New York, from all the large coastal cities. And they're moving because an apartment in Tulsa costs $500 per month compared to $5,000 per month in New York. And if that experiment can be successful in Tulsa, and it's now being replicated in Kansas and Arkansas and Hawaii and Vermont and other parts of the US, why cannot the same experiment happen in Pabna or Shiliguri or a small town in Pakistan? So I think that is one idea that I wish policymakers take up on actively and see if smaller towns in South Asia can be re-energized through programs like Tulsa.
Okay, thanks very much. I get the sense, though, that if we're talking about, the US or perhaps other parts of Europe, that might be much easier to implement and to realize than might be the case in many South Asian nations, simply because broadband access is not as easily accessible. You may have to actually, the 25-25 at sort of Tata Consulting Services is maybe a model that works at Tata because it is Tata, but it may not be sort of amenable to, engagement by organizations further afield, especially in small cities where, I mean, as Uzma had mentioned, even 3G networks, we're on to 4G, but even that is a small proportion of the population that can access it. So I wonder again whether your optimism in terms of what we're seeing in the West is actually implementable, and are there not structural, technological, developmental barriers that would inhibit that? And by the time we get to the right place in terms of all of those things, it may be too late because markets would have shifted. Right now, we're seeing a great degree of, as it were, Easternization, I think, certainly parts of China and Singapore and Malaysia and so on. But there is a slight reversal in terms of what the technology allows us to do. If that reversal is allowed to basically move and progress much faster in Western countries, then we'll again, I think, start to see developing countries basically falling behind. So I wonder if you can comment on that a little bit. You know, the reverse brain drain is not perhaps accessible equally across different parts of the world.
So, Alnoor, the way I see it is, you know, I understand these are real constraints that you mentioned, broadband and physical infrastructure. Not only broadband, if you want to attract talent back to smaller towns across South Asia, you need good schools and you need good housing and you need quality healthcare. But I see an opportunity. So I see entrepreneurs now saying there is a real opportunity to create these facilities in smaller towns. And even in the case of Tulsa, these remote workers who are moving from LA and New York and moving to Tulsa are not typically working from home. So what Tulsa did was they created their own co-working space where there was absolutely excellent broadband facilities. It's called 36 Degrees North. So why don't we conceive of co-working spaces across 100 South Asian smaller cities? And many of the hotels, which are now sort of like really struggling for demand, could be repurposed into co-working spaces. So they already have existing broadband infrastructure. They have physical infrastructure in terms of rooms. They can be repurposed into co-working spaces. And that's just one idea. So I think we should see a sort of flowering of entrepreneurship in these smaller towns, trying to cater to the broadband, healthcare, schooling, and other requirements that these knowledge workers will need once they migrate from large cities back to smaller towns.
Okay, well, it's always nice to hear, you know, ever the optimist in all sorts of ways. I think entrepreneurship in South Asian countries itself faces a huge number of other hurdles. You know, how long it takes to set up a business, venture capitalists, do they want, and so on. But I think that's very. I wanted to ask you, you know, before you leave, just a quick question in relation to some of the comments you made earlier, and this relates to the idea of co-location and perhaps, you know, being able to work from anywhere, but we do have very many creative type industries in South Asia where I think the knowledge is tacit in a way and perhaps not easily codifiable. You can't objectify, you can't embed it into structures and pass it on through digital technologies. It kind of belongs to the person, as it were. And I wonder whether you see that as being also a challenge.
So I think that is a challenge wherever you are, so irrespective of geography. And I have two quick solutions that I want to propose. And both of these are things I'm studying through experiments. And if you are interested, those papers are on my webpage. So the first is to use what I call virtual water coolers. And the idea is that we can socialize in a physical office. And we have done that for decades. But if you think about who we socialize with in the physical office, it's typically the same 5 or 10 people who are sitting on the same floor of our office building. And instead, in a virtual water cooler, such as this, where I had not met any of you prior to today, you can randomly meet people who can have these serendipitous conversations that's helpful for your work. And my work with a global bank has shown that that can be productivity enhancing. The second thing I will say is that despite all the technology in the world, some knowledge, as Alnoor said, cannot be transferred virtually. So that's why I like the TCS 25% model, because it's not 100% remote. You are still meeting your team for 25% of your time every year. And that time, TCS lets the teams decide, not the person, not the company. So whenever the entire team can come together, that's the 25%. And in that 25% time, you can share tacit knowledge, you can build memories together, you can have meals together, you can get to know each other really well. And the rest 75% time, you can go and live in your favorite smaller town. So that's the model which I really like.
Okay, thank you, Prithwiraj. I think that that's all very useful background. I suspect that organizations will probably, get sensitized to experimentation along these lines as we have more cases of the type that you've talked about. So that's very useful indeed. I wanted to come back to you, Uzma, if I may. One of the issues I think we face is the extent to which government should be engaged in as an enabling force. And I wondered whether you feel that we ought to seek to change behaviors through statutory regulation, through different ways in which organizations or people have to operate rather than choose to operate. So, what's the role of the state? What's the role of education? What is the role of regulation as well in terms of creating an enabling environment where women can be more engaged in technology and in the world of work?
Okay, great. I think everyone plays a part when it comes to creating an enabling environment, especially in Pakistan. Pakistan's case, where if we strictly look at it from women's social and economic empowerment perspective, since if you look at public sector also, women have 5% representation, and private sector also is no better, because the constant factor in all these spaces, workspaces, is that we don't really have enabling work environments for women to exist. So definitely the state has to play a part. Of course, our constitution, yes, it talks about equality. So that's their legislation. Yes, Pakistan, some of the provinces in Pakistan, they're legislated in terms of empowerment, comes to implementation, and that's where state's role comes in. So implementation of those laws that have been passed, whether it's on violence, or mostly on the punitive side, mostly on gender-based violence or sexual harassment. So its implementation becomes, a real big challenge. And yes, there are some provinces where implementation is better, but things can be made much improved in terms of implementation in different provinces. So the state authorities, the law enforcement agencies, the funds, they all have, in terms of behavioral change. So that's where I believe states and the government's role come in, and also in terms of budget allocation. So unless those laws, they have specific budgets and funds, they won't be implemented. And I'm not just talking about gender-based violence related, laws. I'm also talking about, the economic scheme that the government, rolls out. So that's where the state's role comes in. But in terms of educational institutions also, I don't know how much you're following. In Pakistan, we have the single national curriculum debate that's been happening. There's a lot of the single national curriculum, it's not very comprehensive. But I think in that case also, if we talk about educational institutions, there is supposed to be some basic level life skill for all institutions, educational, whether they are private sector institutions or public sector education institutions. And by life skills based education, I mean, the education that, that talks about the lessons that talk about how to, the sensitivity around gender norms, about, respect for women and girls in terms of, the human rights and the applying the human rights framework. So that will come from the government. For example, in Sindh's case, the government of Sindh, they did include life skills based education, and they also trained, their teachers extensively. So other provinces like Punjab, now through various projects that World Bank is doing with government of Punjab. So we are looking towards, finding ways to find some sort of module that is, that resembles, life skills based education, and that does talk about different human rights and gender-based violence related sensitivities. At the community level also, it's not just the government's role. At the community level, it's private sector, it's the the power structures that exist at the community level that also need to be sensitized, and that's where the civil society organizations, the women groups, youth groups, their role I think is very important. And you find very many examples in Pakistan, rural support programs. They have played a great role in economically empowering women, and they have also not just, and it's not just limited to economic empowerment. They have also given platforms to women, where women our Bangladeshi counterpart, she talked about she for she. So you will find several examples that exist at the village level, at the community level, where women in those safe spaces, they are also talking about gender-based violence. They're also talking about other issues that concern them. So there are several safe spaces which are not just limited to some community or some NGOs intervention. Some of them are also organic. I would also like to give example of one of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government's intervention, which is called Durshal. So Durshal is this space. They have created this space, which is like a digital connectivity sort of like commune, which you both young women and men, they are given opportunity to try Pakhtunkhwa in Peshawar. It's a very big hit. And in Bannu and in several other, parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, you will see these different spaces, digital spaces, where women for the first time, they're coming out of their homes. They're part of these spaces with men, and in an enabling environment, they are able to, exercise their skills and also utilize their education, which is digital technology. So there are examples, models you will find at various levels where government or civil society or private sector has provided that space, and young women and men or other segments of society, they have capitalized on that. So yeah, not all is lost, and we have some good examples also.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, no, these are clear examples, and I think it also shows a diversity within Pakistan of different potential solutions, some working, some not working so well, and some challenges in implementing them. You do comment also on the notion of the extent to which women are engaged in unpaid care work. And I think your sense is that maybe men should be having a greater engagement in sort of caring for others. Is there a role for the government in that respect?
I believe government can play a role in everything that's to do with women's empowerment, because in Pakistan's case, it's very like I said, it's in some cases it's very similar. The social norms, they're very similar to India and Afghanistan in terms of the regressive nature that they have. So in case, so the government can definitely play a role in that. Sorry, I forgot your question. I'm so sorry. So
absolutely. Just that. I think it was just that, the extent to which the government has a role to play in changing men's attitudes towards their willingness to engage in sort of care work, which presently is unpaid work, mostly done by women. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, government's role can be in terms of like, again, the government has a lot of resources in terms of, that they utilize for media, that they, and again, the education curriculum. So if our men and boys engaging in household work, that can definitely go a long way. In Punjab's case, I think they did include a chapter on gender-based violence and also, household responsibilities in grade 12. So there are examples where the government has done something, towards that, and I think this definitely the government can play a role, but it's not government in unpaid care. that's a huge mandate in which I think the private sector can also play a role. I mean, through their CSR activities, they can, fund activities or fund, media programs where men and boys are, shown equally engaging in household chores. So I think a massive sort of awareness raising will have to be, used to make this work. And I will keep going back to government because if the government is serious in its commitment to increase women's economic participation and women's labor force participation, it cannot happen unless men and boys they equally engage in household chores, and that will happen only if the government's messages are also in that direction.
Okay, thanks very much. One of the challenges that I see there is that governmental engagement is not going to create a homogeneous change of attitudes amongst men, and you're going to find certainly different provinces reacting differently, and indeed provincial governments reacting differently as well, simply because there are such wide contrasts in the attitudes, in the mores, in the values, and so on. What is your sense of that the government basically can only do so much, but standardization never actually prevails? What you have then is specificities of engagement that are provincially based. We might find that in northern Pakistan, it's fairly advanced. There's perhaps more equity. Perhaps towards Balochistan, much less so. And so maybe the government's role in that can, by definition, only be very, very limited. And we have to perhaps, if we want to see that nature of equity that you suggest, we have to resort to non-governmental approaches to behavioral changes. What is your sense of that?
So it's different for different sectors. I mean, if we look at difficult issues like gender-based violence, I believe government can play a really, really important role in that. For example, I mean, I'll give you an example of domestic violence bill that was passed in KP. KP was in fact the last province to pass domestic violence bill. So in that, the government, the Commission on the Status of and also like social welfare department, they spent a lot of time with religious scholars. They actually wanted to present the bill only when religious scholars and other segments of the society, they are all on board with the domestic violence bill. So they were the last ones, but they were able to do that. And also in the rules development which followed after the law was passed, in that also they made sure that representation from district committees and also from local clergy and religious scholars, they also are part of the process, and they don't so this is this whole issue is seen as a societal issue and not something which is against the religion. So and again, we are talking about a very conservative society, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. In case of Punjab also, I think the government dealt with domestic violence issue, again, differently, but they had played a role. So when it comes to, challenges like gender-based violence or human rights violations, I think government's role is crucial, and without its backing, we can't, foresee a transformative change. And if we want to reduce gender-based violence in Pakistan, I mean, and it's not just limited to the whole South Asia is marred with gender-based violence. So if we want to tackle issues like gender-based violence, because again, it is one of the biggest obstacles for women's economic engagement and also for women's engagement in technology or other digital spaces, government, provincial governments, local governments, they will have to play the role. So local councillors, they need to be trained on gender-based violence. They need to have those dialogues and engagements with community women where women, they feel that they can actually talk to a local woman councillor and they can actually, without any fear of repercussion. So I think this tiered approach where all government representatives, whether they are at the local level or at the provincial level or at the departmental level, if they are sensitized on women's empowerment, on gender-based violence issues, things can go a long way. But of course, I mean, again, I mean, I will say that, you know, those civil society organizations, they definitely play a much bigger role than the government when it comes to attitudinal change. So community sensitization, even in Pakistan, I mean, you have, I can give you examples from Africa also, from India. There are several, you know, examples of, you know, rigorous community sensitization models, which have worked very well. And people, you know, they started, you know, sending their girls to schools, or people, you know, there was reduction in gender-based violence. So some of those techniques, they have also worked in Pakistan at village level, at, you know, at the you know, tehsil level. So, and that was driven by community organizations, by local civil society organizations, and they had rigorous modules on behavioral change, on gender transformation, transformative behaviors. You know, a combination of, let's say, you know, local government bodies, you know, coordinating very closely with NGOs that are local to that area. So, both the actors, they are working together to transform behaviors at the community level. So you will find, you know, such examples also, where both government and NGOs, they have worked together to transform behaviors.
Okay, thanks very much, Uzma. I think you're absolutely right. It has to be multilateral. It can't just be, you know, one element of society shouldering. I'd like to maybe turn to Rubana for a last question, which I was really interested and waiting to ask you. So before you entered business, I think you used the words that for yourself and then for other women as well, that in order to get ahead in the world of work or business, that they really need to strategize, engage, and take over. Can you expand on that?
So it was easy. See, so when I started our business, when I joined my husband's business, he was suffering from high blood pressure. And he said, can you help me? Can you help me out? And he was one of the few men who would say that, you know, you should stay home. A great guy, but through and through, well, almost a chauvinist. And I said, no, you don't need to work, you know. And, you know, I was always very, I always had a career. So interestingly, when he asked me to join the business, I did join, but I made sure that in no time, he was a CEO who was never missed. And I kind of drilled into his head that, you know, I could do perhaps a good job. So he trusted me. He was kind enough to trust me, and he was smart enough to have trusted me. So we both had a great partnership, and he made sure that I could make my own decisions. And gradually I made him relax so much that he literally forgot coming to the office and concentrated on trade politics and moved on, and then became a public servant. So I think that was a great career for him, but it also says a lot about men who are so powerful and so gifted that they too can depend on their partners and strategize and make a life for themselves. So I think it's partnership. I think when I ask women to be strategic, what I mean is that, you know, be humane in your approach. Make sure that you get your partner to understand your worth and be honest about it, but also shoulder more responsibility than you can. Now, this has a negative connotation because most of us women end up trying to prove ourselves and end up working doubly hard. That's a stress on us, but, you know, world hasn't really progressed that much yet. So we have a long way to go. And as far as breaking the glass ceiling is concerned, we're still a long way off from there. So till then, we can only hope and keep on proving ourselves and acing in whatever comes in front of us.
Okay, well, yeah, well, hopefully we'll get there earlier than what one might think if women do, in fact, strategize and engage and take over. I hope that that does happen fairly rapidly. So those are great words to end from you, Rubana, but I wanted to just have one more minute from Uzma. And I'd like you, Uzma, to just take no more than a minute as we have to close. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you think being a woman is actually an advantage in the digitalizing economy. I'm not sure we can hear you.
I think I would say it's an advantage, just like, women are going to be or are an asset to any economic sector. So digital spaces, they are no different. Because women, I will just talk in Pakistan's context, because women are not many women, they are part of, the workforce. So whenever they become part of the workforce, they have to prove themselves. They are out there, they give their 100%. So I think, like Rubana, I think in the beginning, Rubana also talked about women as better employers. I think they are also better employees. But I don't want to generalize it. But generally, since women in Pakistan, if they are engaged in STEM fields, their representation is low. I mean, it's about 20%. But when they are in STEM fields, they are very serious. I mean, apart from this women doctors, phenomenon that I talked about there, they don't work. But if women are in engineering or, in other fields, you will find them in very hard situations and things, very good examples. And I'm saying they should have an enabling environment. They are with any opportunity, but now they are in a place where they can actually make it easier for other women. So and another thing I also want to in Pakistan, the lowest gender wage gap is in STEM fields. So I think women also know that if they join the STEM fields or the digital space. In fact, in case of Pakistan, the women who are working in digital spaces, they are generally making more money than men. So the gender wage gap is in fact reverse in case of the digital spaces and the STEM, and not just STEM, the digital spaces. So things since they work in our favor, I think it will be for women and positive women also to join the digital spaces. And since again we get so less opportunities, women, they have a lot to prove, so they will definitely become better employees as compared to men, and wherever they go in digital sector, they will be an asset.
Okay, well, thank you very much. These are nice words to end on. So thank you, Uzma. Thank you, Rubana. Thank you, Prithwiraj, who's now left us. Thank you also for all of you listening, and we hope to see you again. And of course, thank you for the team, so Nilanjan and the whole team at the South Asia Center at the LSE. Looking forward to seeing you soon, and it's goodbye.